Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Aya Fubara Eneli Esq and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression, whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla. As usual with me, before she goes into character, is Aya Fubara Eneli Esq. Women and Resistance. Yeah, good evening. I was about to read my lines. So, Resistant Podcast comes to you every Wednesday, p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And specifically to highlight the roles of women whose life has helped shape the world as we currently know it. But imagine this. A black woman stands before a crowd of 2,000 people in 1860 in Edinburgh, Scotland. She had not only crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a winter storm, but she had been denied entry to schools prior to coming to the United Kingdom. Pushed down a staircase for daring to sit where she wanted to. One would have thought that would have been the first point of call with regards to Rosa Parks' journey. But then she was then subsequently told by an entire nation that her skin made her less than human. And yet, in 1860, she stood there, and not only did she stand, but she also spoke, and she spoke the pains of people back home. That woman is Sarah Redmond. And we have the privilege of having Sarah Redmond with us tonight. So welcome.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for that introduction. And I will definitely fill in on some of those stories, but it's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
So, yes, it's always a pleasure to have our greats, and you are no exception to that qualification. Could you give us for a brief overview for those who probably will be hearing your name for the very first time?
Well, it is with great pleasure that I join you this evening, and there's so much on my mind to share, and so I would have to pick carefully through a lifetime of work. But let me start with sharing a little bit about who I come from. That may help shed some light on why I was able to do the things that I did. For instance, the example you gave of standing before an audience of 2,000 people, and the newspapers all across Scotland and England they're replete with stories that were written about me and the work that I did, although I did eventually choose to leave Britain, and I will explain to you why as well. Well, I was born on June 6th, 1826. So you are listening to me talk with you today in 2026. And what I would encourage your audience to do is to see what, if any, parallels there are between the existence that I will share with you from the past to the present, because that will inform the work that still needs to be done. See, my grandfather, Cornelius Lennox, fought in the American Revolution. He believed in the promise of freedom. He had actually migrated here from a small island next to Venezuela, Caracal. And he came here and he fought in the American Revolution. And my family was deeply, deeply bound to this idea of freedom for everyone. And one of the lessons my mother taught me is that it did not matter that there were some who would consider the complexion of my skin a crime. It was my duty, and for all of my siblings, I recall 8 of us. The archives say there were 11. Perhaps some had, died young before I was born. But my mother ensured that we were all industrious. We all could take care of home, and that we all learned skills that were marketable. Freedom, I came to understand that just because freedom is declared does not mean that freedom is delivered.
Correct.
My father, John Redmond, was a man of skill, discipline, and vision. And he became a citizen of the United States in 1811. My mother, Nancy Lennox Raymond, was a baker. But as I said, she was so much more. My mother became one of the Black women who helped found the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society.
This was in Boston.
And this was in 1832. I was a 6-year-old. This is one of the earliest organizations in the United States of America, led by Black women committed to abolition, education, and collective resistance. I wonder, what are the organizations led by Black women today in the United States of America and beyond committed to? And in what ways are they fulfilling that commitment? The idea of freedom was in the very air that I breathe. And that was the foundation beneath my feet. That we are men and women, and therefore we should be accorded the same respect and opportunities as all people. And so before I ever crossed an ocean or came to stand before thousands, before I ever forced nations to confront themselves, I was first and foremost a daughter of my parents and a daughter of Salem, Massachusetts.
Okay.
A place that spoke of liberty but practiced exclusion, but practiced discrimination. My mother taught us discipline to gather strength from our own souls, regardless of what the world may throw at us. Now, I loved to read. I would read everything, the abolitionist papers, any paper that I could get my hand on. And I was fortunate enough that my family had some elite friends who also had libraries. And so in addition to the public library, I was also able to gain access to their books as well. And I read voraciously. I entered school with curiosity, and I left with a clarity that perhaps a child of my age should not have been exposed to. In Salem, I passed an entrance examination that was used to determine what students were worthy of attending the Salem High School. And yet, within a week, when the parents of the white children realized that there was, as they would call, a colored person in their class, I was expelled from the school because the white parents protested my presence. People must ask themselves, what is it about you that makes you feel so threatened by the mere presence of another? And as I spoke across the United States and later on in Europe, one of the things that I mentioned was the fact that you could not now look down upon what they would call the colored people or the Negro race when you had systematically prevented them from accessing the very tools that would lead them to be able to ascend. So you don't get to deny them, to exclude them, to discriminate against them, and then turn around and use their condition as proof.
You are listening to Women and Resistance with Aya Fubara Eneli Esq and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, Take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation. Of their inability to join you.
That is exactly right. But that moment, being expelled from the school, while it was very humiliating, it did not break me. It simply revealed the truth of the United States of America. But my home was not just a residence. My home was an organizing space. It was a site of strategy, a hub for abolitionist thought. In fact, you may have heard of my brother, Charles Lennox Remond. Charles was the first Black lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society in the 1830s.
Wow.
Now, I say that with a great deal of pride, but also just the irony, the American Anti-Slavery Society. But it was not until the 1830s that a Black man was the first ever Black lecturer. I suppose maybe one could argue it makes sense for white Americans to take on their brethren who, after all, were the slaveholders. But through him and through the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society, I was introduced to some of the greats. I'm talking people like William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips. But it was not for me to just listen and be passive in that way. I was meant to speak. And by the time I was 16, having been a voracious reader, I began lecturing myself. My first engagements were in Massachusetts. I lectured in Groton. I lectured in Salem. And in the 1840s, it was a brother-sister act with my brother Charles. Not an act at all, because these are serious matters after all. We traveled across the Northeast, Massachusetts to Rhode Island to New York, speaking in churches and halls and private gatherings, because many public venues and hotels, I'm sure it would not come as a surprise to any of you to understand that they refused to host us. I wonder, in 2026, what are the spaces that will still welcome Black lecturers who come with the truth on their tongues? Learned quickly that although the North liked to make the distinction of being free, that they were free states, and to say that they were somehow different or better than the slaveholding states of the South, even in free states, freedom had conditions. Take, for instance, the example that you were talking about. I was excited with my friends to attend a musical at the Howard Athenaeum, one of the most prestigious places of our time. We bought our tickets and we got dressed and we went to the location, to the venue, and we went to take our seats. Well, here comes the manager, the white manager. You cannot sit there. Yes, we can, sir. We have paid for our tickets, and here they are. No, you can sit up in the balcony where the Negroes sit. We refuse to move. And so the police were called, and they very roughly handled us. And in that scuffle, I was pushed down the stairs. What themes do you see in that story that still exists today in the United States of America? But I and my family, we were not ones to just let the system treat us in any way they wanted to. My brother had also filed suit against organizations, entities that had discriminated against him, and I filed a lawsuit against the theater and the manager. And I won, and I was given the sum of $500. However, I did not win because I had been denied my seats. I did not win because I had been
pushed down the stairs.
It was a technicality. The judge decided that the problem was the theater had failed to advertise that there was segregated seating. So that was really a fine for their lack of advertising.
Proper
Not that
advertising.
they could not segregate us.
But the fact that they didn't make it known beforehand.
That's it.
No, technicality.
By 1856, I was formally appointed an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, as I tell you my story, I'm well aware that you have spoken with many other women who have been on this path of resistance. And I want you to think back to the numbers of them who joined organizations and who lent their voices and their bodies to speaking up on behalf of those who maybe could not or would not speak up for themselves. Do we still have such people today? Or have most of you retreated to the comforts of your own lives? Because I did come from a family that was doing well, relatively speaking. As a matter of fact, my parents eventually left Salem and they moved us to Rhode Island, that with the idea of being able to give us access to better education. And when we enrolled in those schools, another free state, the town decided to open a separate school and segregate the students. And so some of the well-to-do people of color in the town created their own school. And that was the private school that my sisters and my other siblings and I attended. My appointment as an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society was not just symbolic, but even that came at a cost to the Anti-Slavery Society itself as well. For you see, many across the nation were opposed to men and women sharing the same stage, speaking at the same events. And in one instance, they actually burned down the church at which we were to speak. By the time I got to England, though, having a colored woman speak was actually a big draw. The novelty of it all, I suppose. Fetching Black woman who was articulate enough and confident enough to stand before a crowd. Many came maybe not just in support of the cause, but to see this novelty.
Yeah.
But while I was on the lecture tour across the United States, I spoke with the likes of Susan B. Anthony, Abby Keller Foster, Stephen Foster, and Wendell Phillips. I lectured throughout New York and Massachusetts and the broader Northeast, addressing mixed audiences, Black and white, abolitionist and resistant. And I spoke a truth that was not always welcome, but it was a truth that I refused to have silenced. When I had the opportunity to travel to England, that too was path-breaking in the sense that women did not travel unchaperoned, but I did. 16 days on this ship going across the Atlantic Ocean. Upon arriving in England, I wasn't sure what kind of reception I would get. In fact, I wrote a letter to my friend and I said, most likely, the same issues of prejudice would await me, for that had been my biggest burden in life. But I'm here to say, though there were prejudices, I was well received. On one occasion in 1859, I stood before an audience, a room packed, and I said, I appeal on behalf of 4 million men, women, and children who are chattel in the southern states of America, not because they are identical with my race and color, but because, ladies and gentlemen, they are men. The sum of $1,600 million is invested in their bones and sinews and flesh. The newspapers would often talk about how articulate I was, but they would also say she's rather animated. Of course I would be. These are matters of life and death. I was not appealing to pity. My race needs no such pity. I was demanding recognition of our humanity. I remember writing these words. I fear not the waves, but I know, nor the wind, but I know that no matter how I go, the spirit of prejudice will meet me. From 1859 to 1861, I lectured extensively across Liverpool, London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dublin. I will share with you some books then and where you can find some more information if you would so be inclined to delve further into my life. But I share the bits that I'm sharing with you today also to remind the young men and women of our times, of these days, what is it that you dream of doing that you have been told you cannot do? For in 1859, before the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, I, a Negro woman from the United States of America, took my own fate in my arms and went across an ocean to share the plight of my people, to try to garner some more sources to fight against the oppression of my people. So what is it that you cannot do again, young man, young woman?
Nothing.
My lectures were reported in both British and American newspapers. Now, in one regard, I stood out from many of the male lecturers of my race, for you may already know the likes of Frederick Douglass had been speaking widely as well. And that difference lay in the fact that I spoke not only about slavery, but about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. And you must know that in those times, to even say sexual in mixed company was sacrilegious. But how is it that my race has been tagged by these colonizers and these slaveholders as heathen? And there's this notion of we are sending missionaries to go and save them. And yet, the things that you are visiting upon my people are more barbarous and more heinous than anything that the so-called heathens have ever done. And then you want to silence me, to not speak of that which you do in the dark to my people, to women who look like me. Do we still have these issues in 2026?
Very much so. Very much so.
What is allowed to be brought to light, how you become the one that's tagged as impolite for bringing up things that should be addressed. You understand that in addition to the degradation of slavery itself, for the woman, for the enslaved woman, there was a whole additional layer. When they are exposed for sale, the more Anglo-Saxon blood that mingled in their veins, the more gold was poured out for them. Would you like to hazard a guess as to why?
A purity test?
They were being purchased to be the concubines, I think in today's terms, to be the sex slaves of these men and whomever they chose, the debauchery, the polite dinner parties after which their women will retire, and then these enslaved women would be forced to entertain whomever was brought before them. Are there parallels to that today in your society?
Very much so.
And some were aghast. But don't be aghast at me saying what is happening. Be aghast at the people in their carriages with their top hats, with titles, sitting in your churches and carrying out these heinous acts. Yes, I needed to speak about the plight of the enslaved woman. Now, even while I was in England, I became deeply involved in organizing in Britain as well. I was a founding member of the Ladies London Emancipation Society. And through this organization, I raised funds for abolition, supported the Union cause, advocated for formerly enslaved people. And what I did was work with broader British abolitionist networks and reform circles that were connected to Bedford College, where I eventually enrolled. See, it was important to me to further my education because although I was mostly self-taught and had done very well for myself in that regard, there were still places that were close to me because of assumptions made about my intellect. Of course, there were places close to me due to the color of my skin. And so I enrolled in Bedford College in my mid-30s. And when I was not in college pursuing my studies, I was out lecturing. Bedford College, by the way, it's called Bedford College for Women in London. And I am most likely the first Negro, as they would say, to have been enrolled at the college. There I studied history and French and Latin and literature and elocution. But America was not done playing the games that it loves to play with Black people, African people. We have had many iterations we've gone through in terms of what we are called and what we call ourselves. Call this the Dred Scott shadow. And if you know nothing about the Dred Scott decision, I encourage you to go study that tonight. So, while living in England, I attempted to travel to France and at the time needed to get a visa. Well, I was denied a visa. America decided that based on the Dred Scott decision, I was not a citizen of the United States of America after all. And therefore, they could not give me a visa to travel to France. Even while outside of the country, America tried to define my existence. Well, the Civil War broke out in the United States of America, and I remained in Britain. I remained in Britain for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was because I understood what you all will now call geopolitics. This notion that because you live in a place, you are so myopic in your vision and in your thinking that you do not see the interconnectedness with the rest of the world. It's problematic, to say the least. Remaining in Britain, I used my platform and my affiliation with the Ladies' London Emancipation Society to advocate against British support for the Confederacy. I also encouraged the purchase of Indian cotton over slave-produced American cotton. There are so many pathways to resistance, to fighting, making an impact, to actually ensuring that this declaration of freedom is actualized. And I supported the Union blockade. And after the war, I turned my attention to raising funds for the Freedmen's Aid Association. Because the United States of America had supposedly freed the Negro and left them with nothing. Not the millions of dollars they had made for that nation. Just, you are free. Figure it out. I finished my studies at Bedford College, but I could not remain in Britain either. Because when Britain began their suppression of the rebellion in Jamaica, remember, geopolitics. I spoke out again. Because wherever there is injustice, we must be valiant enough, courageous enough, to not just be concerned about injustice against ourselves, but against everyone. We, after all, are men and women.
And connected as well.
After the war, I did return briefly to the United States, and I worked for a little while with the American Equal Rights Association, advocating for Black suffrage, women's suffrage. Interesting that they have to be in different camps. And I did so not choosing one over the other, because freedom must be to be whole. Can I ever be woman and not black? Can I ever be black and not woman? But I did not stay long in the United States. I returned to Europe, and this time I settled in Florence. I studied medicine at Santa Maria Nuovo, and I later practiced medicine in Italy. I also met and married Lorenzo Pintor. He was an Italian man, and I got married to him just a month shy of my 51st birthday. Some accounts say the marriage was brief. You never know truly what goes on between a married couple. And some others claim we were married until I died. Nonetheless, my focus was on my work, and I served as a physician for over 20 years until my death in 1894 in Rome, and I was buried in the Protestant cemetery. I thought perhaps I could read a little bit of a speech that I gave, if you have the time.
Please do, please do, please do.
Well, thank you.
And what
Although
was
the anti-slavery enterprise was begun some 30 years ago, the evil is still rampant in the land. And the title of this speech is Why Slavery is Still Rampant in the Land. As there are some young people present, and I am glad to see them here, for it is important that they shall understand this subject. I shall briefly explain that there are 32 states, 16 of which are free and 16 slave states. The free states are in the North. The political feeling in the North and the South are essentially different. So is the social life. In the North, democracy, not what the Americans call democracy, but the true principle of equal rights prevails. I speak of the white population. Wealth is abundant. The country, in every material sense, flourishes. In the South, aristocratic feelings prevail. Labor is dishonorable, and 5 million of poor whites live in the most degrading ignorance and destitution. Does that still exist in 2026?
Yes, it does.
I might dwell long on the miserable condition of these poor whites, the indirect victims of slavery. But I must go on to speak of the 4 millions of slaves. The slaves are essentially things with no rights, political, social, domestic, or religious. The absolute victims of all but irresponsible. For the slave, there is no home, no love, no hope, no help. And I need you to dwell on this. And what is life without? Are there still some millions of the descendants of the once enslaved laboring with no hope in 2026? No writer can describe the slave's life. It cannot be told. The fullest description ever given to the world does but skim over the surface of this subject. You may infer something of the state of society in the southern states when I tell you that there are 800,000 mulattoes, 9/10 of whom are the children of white fathers. And these are constantly sold by their parents. For the slave follows the conditions of the mother. Hence, we see every shade of complexion among the slaves, from the blackest African hue to that of women and men in whose cheeks the lily and the rose vie for predominance. I will skip ahead in this speech. The free colored people of the northern states are for no crime, but merely the fact of complexion, deprived of all political and social rights. Whatever wealth or eminence in intellect or refinement they may attain to, they are treated as outcasts, and white men and women who identify themselves with them are sure to be insulted in the grossest manner. I do not ask your political interference in any way. This is a moral question. Even in America,
Seem to have lost Miss
the
Remond,
abolitionists
and
generally
we'll
disclaim
wait for
every
her to
other
come back
grounds
in.
but the moral and religious one on which
Let's
this
see.
matter is based. As I said earlier, but now you hear it in this speech, you send missionaries to the heathen. I tell you of professing Christians practicing. So it appears we did not have these kind of technical difficulties back in my time. And so this is certainly a first for me. I have no idea where what you last heard, but I will.
You were talking about the mulattoes and the fact that yeah.
Okay. So let me repeat that part. You may infer something of the state of society in the southern states when I tell you there are 800,000 mulattoes, 9/10 of whom are the children of white fathers, and these are constantly sold by their parents. For the slave follows the conditions of the mother. Hence, we see every shade of complexion among the slaves, from the blackest African hue to that of women and men in whose cheeks the lily and the rose vie for predominance. You send missionaries to the heathen. I tell you of professing Christians practicing what is worse than any heathenism on record. How is it that they have come to this state of things, you ask? I reply, the whole power of the country is in the hands of the slaveholders. I will pause there and not go any further with this speech because you can find and read it for yourself. But what I want to say to you today...
What's the title? What's the title of the speech?
The title of the speech, again, is Why Slavery is Still Rampant in the Land. And when you read those words that I gave back in 1861, I want you to find the parallels between then and the society in which you live today. It may not be called slavery, and they may not be called slave owners or holders anymore. But is there a different class
capitalist
within
and
whose hands all of the power of the country and increasingly the world is being concentrated?
Oligarchs and capitalists.
And may I also point out this little piece of irony, because we are, after all, men and women, that while Black men have routinely been lynched physically and now in other ways for their supposed interest in white women, the statistic that I shared with you was that 9/10, 90% of the over 800,000 mulattoes had white fathers. So who exactly was violating whom? And which group or race needed to be more concerned about their safety or the morals of the men of a certain group? Just by those statistics alone. There is still so much work that needs to be done. I hope you all will agree. And I would like to share just a little bit of some of the resources that you can go to read more about the work that I did, to hopefully inspire you for the work that you too must do. My life, I must admit, has mostly been overlooked, but it has been preserved in some spaces. There is a book by Shirley J. Yee, Black Women Abolitionists. Another book you might want to take a look at, African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote. Because what's important is to understand what has happened so that you can better situate where you are now and you can have a more impactful strategy for the future. Clara Midgley wrote a book called Women Against Slavery. And of course, Speaking While Female has an anthology including my speeches. There are many other resources: A Voice for Freedom, The Life of Sarah Parker Remond by Lucy Jordan. You can find my speeches on the Negroes in the United States of America, given on January 1st, 1862. You can access some of my speeches and on an online collection with the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I am grateful for all of the ways that the work that I have done is being upheld by some. There have been other ways that I've also been recognized, but that is for you to go research if you so choose, because that is not as important as understanding the work and then locating what your role must be in continuing our fight, our struggle for freedom. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for being with us on Women and Resistance. And to the audience, if this episode moved you, please do share, like, subscribe, do all the great stuff. We've just heard from Sarah Parker Remond, and she was someone who did not just speak, but she spoke out loud. She stood on business, as they would say. So again, we thank her. We will be back next week at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another story, this time that of Ellen Kuzwayo, another woman who refused to be erased. And as we do on this channel, we're not just one track. We travel via multiple tracks. On Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as part of our book reading process, we'll be looking at The Negro in the Caribbean by Dr. Eric Williams. So it's The Negro in the Caribbean, and again, that is part and parcel of what we're trying to do here, which is connect all the strands of who we are as a people, so that way we get an overall picture.
Geopolitics.
Yeah, geopolitics, as you would say, yes. And yes, again, next week will be the turn of Ellen Kuzwayo. Until then, Ms. Remond.
Thank you for your time, and may we continue to stand up as men and women.
On that very positive note, it is good night and God bless. Until next week, good night. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.